Chapter 6. Barbara fidgeted in the polished wooden pew. Married now, it felt like every eye was on her at church. Barbara, her mother whispered. You're fanning quite a gust with that skirt. Settle down, dear. Her mother hadn't hesitated to sit beside her, but her father had yet to even glance in her direction, even though the only person separating them was her mother. Sorry, Mama, Barbara murmured, stillness not coming easily. Her mother's presence helped, but it wasn't quite enough to keep her still. She could almost hear the whispers. Barbara Williams got married just last week, and never got her father's permission. Do you believe it? Her father had hesitated before sitting beside her, not wanting to get that close, and it was obvious. He got up during the service and stood at the far end of their row, leaving a gap wide enough for a family of 10 between him and his wife. His jaw was set firm, his gaze locked forward at the preacher's pulpit as if the man's words might forge a barrier against his discontent. She knew why he distanced himself, her union hadn't been one he'd wanted. But even now, with the vows spoken, he refused to glance her way, let alone offer a nod of acknowledgement. It stung more than the imagined stares of the congregation, because while their scrutiny would fade, her father's disapproval didn't seem to be going anywhere. As the sermon progressed, speaking of trials and tribulations, Barbara found herself drawing parallels between the preacher's words and her resolve. She would navigate this new territory with the same practicality and introspection that had seen her through teaching at the one-room schoolhouse in Clover Creek. Be an example of the believers, the preacher intoned, and Barbara lifted her chin ever so slightly. She would be an example, all right, of strength, of grace under pressure, of love enduring despite the odds. And maybe she believed her father had been partially right, but she would never let him know that. No, her marriage to Harvey was perfect if anyone asked. When the service ended, and the congregation began to file out into the bright light of day, Barbara rose. Her movements were deliberate and calm. She smoothed her dress, took her mother's arm, and together they stepped into the bustling throng outside the church. And somewhere deep within, where the fear and uncertainty dwelled, a small flame of hope flickered to life. Outside the church, Barbara felt the weight of many eyes upon her, as if she were still walking down the aisle in her wedding dress rather than stepping out into the open air of a Sunday morning. Barbara, Harvey. Harvey Bedwell's voice cut through the muffled conversations with an assertive cheerfulness that seemed to command attention even amidst the murmurs of the departing congregation. Barbara watched as Katie approached, her mother-in-law's face alight with a hospitality that was both genuine and theatrical. She clasped Barbara's hands in hers, a broad smile gracing her features. You must come for Sunday dinner today. It's not every day we get to celebrate having a new daughter in the family, Katie announced, her voice carrying with the ease of someone accustomed to being heard. Harvey, standing beside Barbara, gave a subtle nod, his brown eyes warm with appreciation for Katie's efforts to bridge any gaps her family might have left open. We'd be honored, Katie, he said, his arm resting comfortably around Barbara's waist. Katie then turned her attention toward Barbara's parents, who lingered a few paces behind, her mother offering a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, her father's expression etched with lines of reluctance. And you too, of course. It wouldn't be right without the whole family, Katie added with a flourish. Even Stanley and Charlotte will be there. Barbara's mother accepted the invitation with a soft, "That would be lovely, Katie." "Thank you." Her father, however, hesitated. "Suppose it'll be all right," he muttered. There was no doubt in Barbara's mind that he was only agreeing so he didn't have to eat her mother's cooking. He'd gotten used to decent food after his daughters had taken lessons from Henri, and he would be suffering as he tried to eat her mother's cooking every night. But Barbara saw through the gruff exterior of the man who had sired her. He cast a sideways glance at his wife, a look that wasn't missed by Barbara. It was the same look he gave whenever he spoke of his next meal with dread, knowing well the culinary misadventures that awaited him at their own table. The prospect of Katie's well-renowned roast and potatoes, undoubtedly, was a far more enticing offer. "Then it's settled," Katie declared, her enthusiasm undiminished by the cool response. "We'll see you at the house then." As the families parted ways, Barbara caught Harvey's eye. There was a shared understanding between them, an acknowledgement of the small victories involved in getting her father to spend time with them. "Thank you," Barbara whispered to Harvey as they walked together, her hand finding his. "For being by my side." "Always," Harvey replied, the simplicity of his bow carrying the weight of 1,000 promises. Once they arrived at Katie's house, Barbara stood at the sink, sleeves rolled up to her elbows, her hands submerged in soapy water. The clink of porcelain and the scent of roast beef lingered in the air as she scrubbed the china plates clean. Her mother, standing beside her, dried each one with a practiced hand, setting them aside with quiet efficiency. "Thank you, Barbara," her mother said softly, a smile crinkling the corners of her eyes. "It's nice to work alongside you like this." "Of course, Mama." Barbara's reply was warm, laced with contentment that came from the simple act of sharing chores. It felt good to work beside her mother as she had so many times in the past. In the dining room, voices began to rise above the congenial hum of post-dinner chatter. Barbara glanced through the doorway to see her husband Harvey's father, George Bedwell, standing with a rigid back, his weathered face set in lines of displeasure. Her father, a man of few words but many frowns, faced him, a silent challenge emanating from his stance. "Men ought to treat their womenfolk with respect, George," her father's voice was gruff, edged with accusation. "Women aren't cattle to be driven, nor possessions to be owned." "Respect?" George's laugh was a harsh bark. "You speak of respect when you've shown none for your daughter's choice. You're no different than me, not supporting her union with my boy." Barbara's breath caught in her throat. She exchanged a worried look with her mother, whose fingers tightened imperceptibly around the dish towel. "Harvey is a farmer," her father retorted. "My girl deserves better than the life of toil he can give her." "And you're a rancher. How is that life better than that of a farmer?" George's voice rose. "I led our wagon train across half this country. I know what it takes to survive out here. That boy of mine, he's strong, and he will succeed out here. He'll build Barbara a life that'll stand firm against any storm." The argument had drawn the attention of the other family members, who now watched with an uncomfortable silence. Barbara felt the weight of their gazes, the scrutiny that seemed to magnify her new role as a married woman in this close-knit community. "Survival isn't just about withstanding storms," her father said sharply. "It's about thriving. About marrying the right person who will treat you as an equal." "Thriving is exactly what they'll do," George retorted. "They got love and grit. And that's more than enough. Maybe you should mind your own business." Her mother's hand rested briefly on Barbara's shoulder, a silent message of solidarity. Barbara took a deep breath, feeling the courage that came from knowing she was not alone. She thought of Harvey's steady support and the determination in his brown eyes. "Let's finish up here," Barbara said quietly to her mother, turning back to the dishes. As the water in the basin was thrown outside, she thought of the rivers they'd crossed and the mountains they'd scaled. Every journey had its perils, but also its passages of beauty and triumph. The door slammed with a force that seemed to rattle the very foundations of Katie's home. Barbara watched, her heart seizing in her chest, as her father's firm grip on her mother's arm hurried her down the porch steps and into the wagon. Her mother cast a fleeting, pained look over her shoulder, a silent plea for understanding, that pierced Barbara deeper than any spoken word could. "Barbara." Harvey's voice was soft but insistent, pulling her attention away from the retreating figures. His hand closed gently over hers, warm and grounding. She allowed herself to be led outside and toward their own home, their wagon having been left in front of their barn. Once they were a safe distance from the house, Harvey wrapped his strong arms around her, and she nestled against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. Your pa, he didn't understand what my father was trying to say, Harvey finally murmured, breaking the quiet. I know. Barbara sighed, tilting her head to look up at him. It's just pride. And fear, I think. Fear of change, of losing control. Same could be said about my pa, Harvey admitted, his gaze meeting hers squarely. Both men are cut from the same cloth, they both feel the burden of family and land. But we're different, Barbara. We've seen what love can do, what it can weather. They began to walk the path back to their small cabin, side by side, their footsteps in easy rhythm in the dirt. Seems like our fathers are still fighting battles from the past, Barbara mused aloud as they reached their doorstep. But we fight for the future. Right you are, Mrs. Bedwell, Harvey quipped with a twinkle in his eye as he opened the door for her. Our future. Inside, the simple comforts of their home embraced them, the hearth, the humble furnishings, the quilt on their bed. For the first time, when Barbara walked inside, the place felt like hers. Barbara stood at the wooden table, her hands coated in flour as she kneaded the bread with practiced ease. Each push and fold was rhythmic, providing a quiet moment to gather her thoughts before the start of another bustling week. The dough beneath her palms was soft and pliable, unlike her father's opinions. Smells like heaven in here, Harvey commented, his voice carrying from the doorway where he leaned, watching her work. She glanced over her shoulder, smiling at him. Fresh bread for tomorrow, she explained, and I'm trying something new for tonight. Venison stew filled with some of the vegetables my mother and I grew together. Ah, he nodded approvingly, the corners of his mouth lifting into a grin. That'll make for hearty eating. Enough for 2 meals, she added, mentally calculating how the effort now would ease her load after a long day of teaching. She covered the dough with a cloth to let it rise and wiped her hands on her apron before turning to Harvey. Speaking of tomorrow, Barbara began, I've been thinking about my students again. Those little rascals sure have found a place in your heart, Harvey said, pushing himself off from the doorframe and walking closer. They have, she agreed. It's more than just reading and arithmetic, you know? It's about giving them hope, showing them possibilities beyond the farm or the next wagon train. I want them to know they can be more than farmers and ranchers if they want to be. Harvey reached her side, his hand finding its way to rest gently on the small of her back. I see it, the way your eyes light up when you talk about your lessons. You're shaping the future, Barbara, one child at a time. She realized then he knew her better than she'd thought. He understood her, not just her desires, but also the weight of responsibility she carried for those young minds. Thank you, Harvey, she murmured, and meant it with every fiber of her being. For believing in what I do. I do believe in the children being taught, he replied, his voice as solid as the earth beneath their feet. Just as you believe in us. Let me set the table, she suggested. Supper won't be long now. It smells really good, Harvey said, taking a seat at the head of the table to watch her work. He couldn't believe how good it felt to see her taking care of him. After the supper dishes were done and put away, Harvey lifted her chin with gentle fingers. Barbara's breath caught at the tenderness in his touch, a stark contrast to the calluses born of tending unforgiving land. His lips met hers. Barbara, he whispered against her skin. She leaned into him, her body answering a call as old as time itself. His hands moved over her body, enjoying the softness of her skin. Underneath the simple cotton of her nightdress, her skin awakened to his touch. As they moved together on the bed, she found the pleasure in his embrace that her mother had promised would come. Harvey was truly the man she wanted to spend her life with, and she was glad to be his. As their rhythm slowed and the world outside faded into insignificance, Barbara felt the weight of the week's hardships lift from her shoulders. The stern faces of the congregation, her father's cold disapproval, the tension-filled dinner, they all paled in comparison to the sanctuary she found in Harvey's embrace. He held her close, his breaths evening out as sleep claimed him, strong arms a barricade against any lingering specters of doubt. Yes, the week had been hard, but as she nestled into the crook of Harvey's arm, Barbara knew beyond a shadow of a doubt why she had married him. It was for moments like these, quiet and unremarkable to the outside eye. And as she fell asleep, their bodies entwined, Barbara knew that despite the trials of the week, this was where she belonged. In Harvey's arms. Chapter 7. Harvey Bedwell wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of a calloused hand, leaving a smudge of dirt on his tanned skin. The sun beat down unforgivingly upon his broad shoulders, as he heaved another load of hay into the trough for his small herd of dairy cows. He straightened up for a moment, flexing his aching back, surveying the fruits of his labor that stretched across the modest expanse of his farm. He sauntered over to the wooden fence that bordered his property, eyeing the warped boards with a critical gaze. One by one, he set to work, hammering nails and bracing posts. Each strike of the hammer echoed through the open air. As Harvey worked, his thoughts drifted to Barbara, his eyes softening at the image of her dark hair and those curious gray eyes. She was still at the schoolhouse now, imparting knowledge and guidance to the young minds of Clover Creek, but not for much longer. Soon she'd be here with him full-time, and he couldn't wait. A wife's place was in the home, not in the schoolhouse. He imagined her beside him in the fields, her skirt hitched up as she milked the cows, or laughing as she tried her hand at helping mend the fences. Or perhaps she'd prefer the sanctuary of their home, filling it with the sense of her cooking, the fragrance of fresh bread, and the sweet tang of her latest concoction. Harvey knew the choice was hers. It mattered little to him so long as she was home where she belonged. His mind wandered to the evenings they would spend side by side on the porch, watching the stars emerge like shy sparkles against the blanket of night. It wouldn't be an easy life, but it was theirs. With Barbara's intelligence and his strength, they would build a farm their family could be proud of. Asterisk. The wooden door to the one-room schoolhouse creaked open, ushering in a cool draft that stirred the chalk dust motes dancing in the slant of sunlight. Barbara glanced up from the arithmetic problems she was correcting, the slate gray of her eyes alighting with recognition and warmth as her mother entered. "Ma," she greeted. "I wasn't sure you'd ever be allowed to speak to me again." "Barbara," her mother replied, "I thought we could have lunch together and talk." "Of course," Barbara assured her, setting aside her work and rising gracefully from the small desk. They stepped outside where the children played during their lunch hour. "As you know, your Pa and George had words again," her mother began without preamble, tucking a stray lock of dark hair behind Barbara's ear. "I swear, your father can be as stubborn as a mule." "Pa's always been set in his ways," Barbara said. "But surely they'll come to an understanding soon? Those two?" Her mother snorted with a humor that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'll not let it linger much longer. Family shouldn't stay at odds, especially here where we all depend on each other to survive." Barbara nodded. "I don't worry much about him arguing with George. But it would be good if Pa and Harvey were able to see eye to eye. Speaking of which," her mother continued, "we're coming to supper Saturday night. Your Pa needs a good meal to soften him up, and he's always liked your cooking best." Heat rose to Barbara's cheeks at the praise. "What would you have me make?" "Jelly rolls," her mother declared, her voice imbued with the certainty of one who knew the direct path to a man's heart. "Your Pa loves them so. Makes him remember better times." "Jelly rolls it is, then," Barbara agreed. She'd need to get the filling just right, but she had experience making them for her Pa. "Make enough to fill his belly, and maybe his heart will follow," her mother advised with a wink, before turning back toward home. As she rang the bell, summoning the children back to their lessons, Barbara felt a surge of resolve. She would create a feast for her parents, and perhaps her Pa's heart would soften toward Harvey. Barbara's steps hastened as the schoolhouse door closed behind her. She clutched a small bundle of lesson plans to her chest as she ventured towards the place she now called home. The sun was slipping lower in the sky, casting elongated shadows that seemed to reach for her as she navigated her way through Clover Creek. Harvey, she called as she approached the modest homestead where Harvey was likely still at work. His form soon came into view. He paused, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a dirt-streaked hand, and turned to greet her with a smile that never failed to set her heart aflutter. "Barbara," he said, "you're home. Ma and Pa are coming for supper this Saturday," she announced, breathless from more than just her walk. "Ma says it's time to mend fences, and she believes my cooking might just do the trick." Harvey's brown eyes held a glint of amusement as he leaned against the sturdy fence he'd been mending. "Your cooking could probably calm a stampeding herd." "What's the plan?" "Jelly rolls, for starters. Pa's favorite." Barbara released. "Chicken pot pie, then," Harvey suggested, nodding. "Hearty food for peace." "Exactly." A smile played upon her lips. "And after supper, cards. Euchre, perhaps. Pa loves to play euchre." "Sounds like a fine evening," Harvey said. As the days passed, Barbara's mind churned like butter, thoughts settling on the details of the impending supper. Between grading papers, she worked at creating a menu that would fill her Pa with the love she was used to seeing from him. In the quiet of each evening, as the candles dimmed to whispers of light, she sat across from Harvey. "Do you think it will be enough?" she asked. "To bring Pa around?" "Your father's a tough nut," Harvey replied. "But I know he loves you, and he doesn't want to stay angry." With each dish she planned, her goal was on her mind. The promise of Saturday loomed large, a beacon of potential reconciliation. But as Barbara lay beside Harvey in the pre-dawn stillness, his steady breathing a counterpoint to her racing thoughts, she couldn't shake the fluttering in her chest. Her job at the school would end in another week, but tonight, she would pour her heart into a meal that could just turn her father's heart back to her. Asterisk. Just before 5, the door to the homestead swung open, ushering in a chill that nipped at Barbara's cheeks. Her parents had arrived. The scent of chicken pot pie, rich and inviting, mingled with the warmth from the hearth and seemed to embrace them. Beside the golden-crusted centerpiece on the table lay a batch of jelly rolls, their spirals tight and perfect, promising the sweetness that her father had always favored. "Looks fit to feed a crowd," her mother remarked, her eyes sweeping over the spread with an approving glint. Her father, however, remained silent, his gaze fixed somewhere between stern and contemplative as he took his seat without a word. Dinner passed with the clink of cutlery against plates and the occasional exchange about the weather and the health of the livestock. Though her father's voice was absent from the conversation, Barbara noticed the subtle softening around his eyes when he bit into a jelly roll, a vestige of pleasure coursing through him. As the plates were cleared away, Harvey dealt the first hand of euchre with practiced ease. Barbara watched him, noting the way his brow furrowed slightly in concentration, his fingers deft and sure as they shuffled and distributed the cards, a quiet strength she'd come to rely on. "Your turn, Ma," Barbara said, passing the deck for the next deal. Her mother accepted it with a chuckle, remarking on how the game had been their family's favorite way to pass the time after supper on the trail. Her father, whose words had been scarce since his arrival, finally broke his silence when it came time to switch partners. "Let's see if you can keep up with your old man," he said, his voice carrying a trace of the challenge that had always sparked Barbara's competitive spirit. As they played, Harvey's attentiveness never waned. He praised Barbara's strategic play with a gentle smile, offered advice with a nod, and shared laughter with a look that held more affection than amusement. It was then that Barbara caught her father observing them, not with the critical eye of a man weighing his daughter's choices, but with the dawning realization that the union before him was rooted in something enduring. His features, so often etched with the lines of hardship and dissent, eased ever so slightly. "Seems you've found yourself a partner who knows your mind, Barbara," her father conceded. "Can't say I approve of everything, but a man who looks after my girl the way Harvey does, well, he can't be all bad." The laughter that bubbled up within Barbara was one of relief and unbridled joy. In this moment, it wasn't just about winning a game of euchre, it was about winning her father's acceptance. "Thank you, Pa," she whispered, her words nearly lost in the shuffle of the next hand. Barbara exchanged a look with her mother, who was smiling at her and nodding. Their gamble had worked, and she couldn't be happier about it. Barbara stacked the dishes with a gentleness that belied her eagerness to be done with the task, the wooden floorboards creaking under her feet as she moved back and forth between the dining table and the kitchen. Harvey's breathing deepened while she lay awake, tracing the patterns of the wood on the ceiling with her eyes. Her mind wandered to the schoolhouse, to the children whose faces lit up with each new letter learned and each problem solved. The thought of leaving that behind, of abandoning her contribution to the town, sent a pang through her. She loved this life beside Harvey, the promise of what they were building together, but the prospect of her job ending, a job that had given her purpose, left her restless. It wasn't just about teaching. It was about being part of something bigger, of being a contributing part of the community. As sleep finally claimed her, she clung to the hope that perhaps there was a way to blend the two, to find a way to keep teaching and still be Harvey's wife. She could take on students who were struggling, but she'd rather stay in the schoolhouse, teaching all the children. Chapter 8. Harvey Bedwell's boots sank into the scorched earth, his gaze locked onto the fire consuming his barn. The heat was a living thing, clawing at his skin. He stood motionless, the muscles in his jaw tensed, as the blaze devoured the structure he had raised with his own hands. The sky, which had heralded the promise of a new day just a short while before, was now filled with thick smoke. It obscured the sun, casting a pall over the land that had been his family's hope, their future. Harvey's practical nature commanded him to act, to do something, anything, but for a moment, he was as still. He was thankful the cows had been out grazing when it struck, but winter would soon be upon them, and there would be no shelter for his animals. He had a bit of lumber left over from the barn's construction that he'd hoped to use to build a house the following year, but that couldn't happen now. No, it would take everything he had to have a new barn constructed before snow hit, and he would have to sell off some of his dairy cows. As the fire continued its merciless rampage, the reality of his situation. This barn had been more than just a shelter for livestock or storage for hay. It had held his future, the food he would feed his cattle through the winter. And now, it seemed, everything he had worked for the past 5 years was gone. For now, though, he must confront the immediate threat, battle the blaze until it relented, and then, somehow, find a way to begin again. He couldn't let the fire take his home. Harvey stood, his hands hanging limply by his sides, as the last of the flames died out, giving way to smoke that smeared the morning sky. The barn, his barn, was no more than a skeleton now, the bones blackened and fragile against the quieting inferno. His dark hair, usually slicked back with sweat from honest work, now lay matted against his forehead, tinged with grime and ash. Brown eyes that had sparkled with purpose as he hammered each nail and sawed each plank stared blankly at the devastation. All he had built had evaporated before him. "Harvey." The word was whispered, a ghost on the breeze, but he didn't turn. Couldn't turn. To acknowledge the voice would be to acknowledge the reality that his barn, his livelihood, was gone. The weight of the loss pressed down on his broad shoulders. But Harvey Bedwell was not one to yield easily. He felt a tide of despair that threatened to drown his spirit. Farming was a gamble against nature, he knew that. He had conquered droughts, floods, and the relentless sun, but the fire was a beast of different metal. It left nothing in its wake but the bitter taste of defeat. And for a moment the temptation to release the dreams he'd nurtured was alluring. "Harvey." This time the call was firmer, but it barely cut through the fog of his thoughts. The silence of the aftermath was punctuated only by the occasional hiss or crackle from the smoldering ruin. Harvey's jaw set firmly, refusing to admit defeat. He would rebuild, and though it would take everything inside him, everything he had, he would emerge triumphant. "Harvey." Closer now, the voice held an undercurrent of strength. And perhaps, just maybe, that was enough to begin anew. Barbara stepped closer, and as he felt her body press into his, he knew that he had to rebuild, if only for her. The barn's gone, but your cattle are still grazing in the field, she reminded him. We can rebuild, Harvey. You're not alone in this. Rebuild with what? His voice was tinged with bitterness. It took every last cent to put that up. Now, he trailed off, his hands balling into fists at his sides. The doubt that spread through Harvey threatened to paralyze him. Could he bear to start from scratch, to face another season of relentless toil with no guarantee of reward? His mind conjured images of the lush greenery of the East, where life was predictable, if not constrained. Yet, the thought of surrendering to that ease felt like donning shackles. This land, with its untamed beauty and harsh lessons, had become a part of him. Could he truly turn his back on it? Harvey. Barbara's voice was soft but insistent. You've survived worse. You crossed rivers and mountains to get here. This is just another river to cross. He wanted to believe her, to find solace in her words. But all he could think of was the work and the money that had gone into that barn. There was no food left for the animals for the winter. There was no place for them to shelter, and he knew he couldn't afford to build another. There was no time before winter set in. If only the fire had happened in the spring, he would have time to grow more crops and to slowly build his barn again. Just before winter had to be the worst time there was to have a barn fire. The decision lay before him, stark and demanding. It was a moment that demanded more than mere hope, it required a belief in himself that felt as distant as the stars overhead. With each passing second, the scales of his resolve tipped precariously between despair and determination. Perhaps it's time to forge a new path, he finally said, voice roughened by smoke and inner turmoil. Or maybe it's time to take what's been learned and build something stronger. There's no real choice, Barbara said. We build something stronger. As the embers glowed faintly amidst the ruins, so too did a spark within Harvey Bedwell, a flickering flame that refused to be extinguished by fear or failure. I can't let this be the end, he muttered. Asterisk. Harvey's boots left sooty prints on the wooden floor of Clover Creek's chapel as he and Barbara Williams entered. A hushed murmur rippled through the congregation, a wave of concern washing over their faces. He felt the weight of their eyes on him. Harvey, said Pastor Scott, his voice a gentle baritone that carried both authority and kindness. We heard about the fire. We're here for you. One by one, his neighbors approached, rough hands clasping his own, calloused from labor and shared hardship. The women offered soft words, their gazes lingering with an empathy born of their private trials. Men who had tamed the land alongside him now offered to lend their strength to rebuild what was lost. Got some lumber laying around. It's yours if you need it, Tom Mason declared, his brow furrowed with earnest sincerity. Martha and I can bring meals over while you get things set right again, added Andrew Jefferson, with a nod from his wife affirming the promise. Barbara stood beside him, her hand finding his, a silent pillar of support. Her gray eyes never wavered, reflecting not just the blaze that had threatened to consume his life's work, but the resolve to rise from its ashes. Thank you, Harvey managed, his voice hoarse from the swell of gratitude that tightened his throat. These were more than neighbors, they were a family forged by the trail, bound by a mutual understanding that here survival was a communal effort. As the service ended, Harvey's mind shifted into the practical gears necessary for survival on the trail. He walked the perimeter of his blackened farm, Barbara at his side, his gaze taking in the devastation with the dispassionate eye of a man who had faced down rattlers and river crossings. He counted the cattle, realizing all had survived his mental arithmetic, cataloging assets and needs. When her paw appeared in front of him, he was ready for a tongue lashing, knowing the man felt he wasn't good enough for his daughter. Instead, Mr. Williams offered, I have some lumber left from building the house. I know Appleby has some too. We'll be over early on Saturday, with as much lumber as we can put together, and that barn will be rebuilt before the snow flies." Harvey nodded in disbelief. It was all he could do to keep tears from coursing down his cheeks. "I would appreciate that, sir." "Not doing it for you," Mr. Williams added gruffly. "My daughter and future grandchildren need that barn for their livelihood." Several other men stepped up to say they would be there on Saturday morning as well. Even the owner of the mill came over. "I have lumber that was never claimed, and there are always a few too many pieces cut for someone's needs. They're yours. I'll start delivering tomorrow. And I'll be there on Saturday morning to help build that new barn." Before they left the church, they had many men volunteering to help build the barn, and women promising to bring meals to feed the workers. "We'll get it done in no time," George Bedwell said to his son with a smile. Harvey was in disbelief as they left the church that morning. "I can't believe all that's being done for us." Barbara smiled at him. "We made that trek across the plains together. We're family, and family helps family." After their lunch, Harvey and Barbara set out to assess the damage done by the fire. Most of the barn was gone, but there still might be beams and boards that could be used. "Foundation still solid," he noted aloud, kicking at the remnants of a wall. "Some of these beams might be salvaged too." "Your pa taught you well," Barbara observed. She understood his need for order, for a plan amidst chaos. "Pa also said, 'Don't count your chickens before they hatch,'" Harvey replied, quoting the wisdom that had seen his family through lean times before. "Then we'd best start counting what we've got and what we'll need," she said, her hand squeezing his. "First, we clear the land," Harvey stated. "Then we take stock of materials. After that, we draw up the plans for the new structure." His words laid out the path ahead like a map. "I'll start clearing this out tomorrow after the ashes have cooled a bit more." "Stronger." "Better," Barbara said. "Stronger." "Better," Harvey affirmed. This was not the end of Harvey Bedwell, farmer of Clover Creek. No, it was merely another chapter in the saga of a man and a woman carving out a life together. As Harvey made his way back home, he couldn't ignore the serpent of doubt that wound its way through his thoughts. The cost of materials, the labor, the time, all of it weighed on him like the yoke of an oxen. "Harv?" Barbara's voice broke through his reverie. Her gray eyes met his, and he saw her own resolve mirrored there. "Barb," Harvey began, his words hesitant, "the rebuilding, it's going to take more than we have. We might need to take out a loan. Even with all the help we're getting, it's going to be costly." Barbara nodded, reaching into the pocket of her apron. "I thought as much," she said, her voice steady despite the uncertainty ahead. She pulled out a small, worn leather pouch and pressed it into his hands. "Is this from teaching?" she interrupted. "It's not much, but it's a start. And it's ours, no bank strings attached." Harvey felt the weight of the coins through the leather, feeling a weight lifting from his shoulders. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close. "I hate to take your money, but thank you. We do need it." "Thank you," he whispered, feeling the tremble of his relief. "Nothing to thank me for. We're in this together," Barbara replied. "It feels good to be able to help." "What would I have done without you beside me?" he asked. "I sure hope you never have to find out," she said with a smile. Asterisk. First thing on Monday morning, Harvey headed to the sawmill at the edge of town. His boots crunched on the gravel as he strode up to the sawmill, the sun casting long shadows over the stacks of freshly cut lumber. The scent of pine was strong in the air, mixing with the metallic tang of sawdust and sweat. He pulled the worn leather pouch from his pocket, its contents more precious now than ever before. "Morning, Amos," Harvey greeted the sawmill owner, a wiry man with a face weathered like an old saddle. "Harvey." Amos wiped his hands on his apron, leaving streaks of sawdust on the fabric. "Heard about the fire?" Mighty sorry. Thanks. I'm here to buy lumber. All I can get for. Harvey paused, his fingers tightening around the pouch. This is what I have. Amos didn't bother to count the coins. I'll donate what I have sitting around and give you a fair price for the rest. We take care of our own here. Much obliged, Harvey replied, the words tight in his throat. As the men shook hands, a cloud of dust rose from the road. One by one, wagons creaked into view, each laden with timber. Herbert Jensen, the blacksmith, with his broad shoulders dwarfing the wagon's seat, Roy Williams, whose laughter could lift spirits as easily as his strong back lifted bales, Melody Appleby, her gray hair escaping its bun, they all came. Looks like you may have enough without buying more, Amos remarked, nodding toward the newcomers. He pressed the pouch back to Harvey. Save this for feed for your herd for the winter. I think we can rebuild without more lumber than what is being donated by the looks of things. Seems so, Harvey managed, his voice rough with emotion. We're all putting our lumber together and seeing if more is needed, Herbert called out, jumping down from his perch. Laughter and chatter filled the air as the community gathered, their hands ready to work, their hearts invested in the rebuild. We'll get it all out to your place on Saturday. Stronger. Better, Harvey murmured to himself, rolling up his sleeves. The mantra wasn't just words, it was the very sinew and spirit of Clover Creek. With every plank unloaded from the wagons, he felt his dream taking shape again. This was the miracle he'd needed so badly. No one left until every wagon was unloaded and the planks had been counted. Thank you, Harvey said at last, his voice carrying over the sounds of the mill. For all of this. None of us would be here if it weren't for folks like you, Harvey, Mr. Jensen replied. We're all planting seeds for the future, aren't we? Yes, we are, Harvey agreed. The clatter of dishes being scrubbed clean resonated in the background, a comforting cadence to the evening's merriment. Barbara was so thankful for the help that she'd had that day, and the help she was still being given in the form of help with the dishes. As night settled fully over the farm, Harvey leaned back, the rough wood of the newly erected barn pressing against his shoulders. His heart was full. Less than a week before his world had been completely shattered by a fire, and here he was, with a barn that was not only larger but sturdier than the one he'd built himself. God was good. Harvey pushed his empty plate aside and stood up, his boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. The twilight cast a serene glow over the assembled crowd, men wiping their mouths with the backs of their hands, women tucking stray hairs back into buns, children chasing each other between the tables. He cleared his throat, and the chatter began to wane as all eyes turned toward him. Friends, he began, his voice carrying across the clearing, I stand here before you, humbled. His gaze swept over the faces before him, each one etched with the day's labor. This morning, we had but a charred patch of land, and now, as the sun sets, we have a barn. Not just any barn, he gestured behind him, but a barn big enough to handle the needs of my herd for a long time to come. He saw nods and heard murmurs of agreement. You've all given a day of sweat and strength, asking for nothing in return. This barn isn't just mine and Barbara's. It belongs to all of us. It's a symbol of our strength, a shelter not only for my livestock, but for our shared spirit. Many of you have known the same loss, the same trials on the trail that brought us here, Harvey continued. And just as you have lifted me up today, know this, I am here for you. If any of you ever find yourselves in need, you only have to ask. A chorus of amens and that's right filled the air, and Harvey sat down, feeling as though a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. As plates were collected and leftovers wrapped, Barbara found herself seated next to the teacher, Mrs. Thompson, who was gently rocking her swaddled infant in her arms. The woman's face was illuminated by the orange flicker of nearby lanterns, shadows dancing across her features. Barbara, Mrs. Thompson's voice was soft, but carried an undercurrent of concern. I've made a decision. I'll be staying home with my little one. The schoolhouse needs a teacher, and I'm at odds about what's to become of it. Barbara, her gray eyes reflecting the firelight, nodded solemnly. She understood the gravity of education in their small community, the way it could shape their future out here in the wild expanse. Mrs. Thompson, Barbara replied with the same practical tone she used when addressing her pupils, the children will have their teacher. Her commitment to the community, to the survival and growth of Clover Creek, resonated in her words. They both sat for a moment, watching the flames dance, knowing that the challenges they faced on the trail were not so different from those they encountered in building a life here. But in both, there was the unyielding determination to prevail, to thrive against the odds. Mrs. Thompson smiled. Thank you, Barbara. Knowing you'll be taking my place takes a burden off me. I was worried that the children would miss a year of education. Barbara returned the smile, her thoughts already turning to lesson plans and reading exercises. Like everyone gathered here tonight, she was ready to give her all for the promise of tomorrow. As the last of the community members waved their farewells and the dust from the wagons settled back to the earth, Barbara stood at the edge of the porch, her silhouette framed by the doorway. She drew in a deep breath, her mind already churning with the alphabet and arithmetic. Harvey, she called softly. She knew she needed to tell him what she'd promised to do, even though she knew he wouldn't like it. It was necessary for the survival of their community, and for their survival with the hay they'd lost. He turned from where he was securing the tools, his hands roughened from the day's labor, and walked toward her. His brown eyes held a mixture of fatigue and satisfaction. Barbara? Harvey's voice rumbled like distant thunder across the prairie. Harvey, I've made a decision, Barbara began, her gray eyes locking onto his. I'm going to teach for the rest of the school year. The children need an education, and we need the money. His brow creased slightly, and for a moment, silence hung between them like the calm before a storm. He knew the value of what she offered, not just to their own survival, but to that of the entire settlement. Without asking me? There was a tinge of hurt in his words, but also an understanding that matched the depth of the furrows he plowed each season. Time was short, and the need is great, she said. It will ensure we can afford the hay for winter. Once the school finds a permanent teacher, I'll step down. Harvey exhaled slowly. All right, he conceded, the corners of his mouth lifting ever so slightly in a weary smile. We'll do what we must to keep the farm, and the herd, secure, through the winter. Thank you, Harvey. Barbara reached out, resting a hand gently on his arm, feeling the solid muscle beneath her fingers. I know this isn't easy, for either of us. Nothing about this land is easy, Barbara. But it's ours, and we'll do what we must to protect it. Just like we did on the trail. He didn't like that she would still be teaching, but he knew she loved it, and more than that, they did need the extra money her salary would bring in. He promised himself that by the time school was out, he would make enough to sustain them, and she would be able to be home with him. Come on, he said as he turned toward the house, let's get some rest. We've got another long day ahead. Together, they stepped inside, the door closing behind them with the soft certainty of a shared conviction to face whatever the new dawn would bring. They were both too tired to do more than hold one another that night, but they were happy with their weariness. They had a barn and a means to buy more hay. Life was good. Chapter 10. Barbara watched as Harvey led their parents toward the house. The scent of fresh-baked bread wafted through the air, mingling with the savory aroma of the rabbit stew she had been experimenting with for supper. Her heart fluttered with a mix of nerves and anticipation about hosting both families together for the first time since their nuptials. Looks like they're ready for your feast, Barbara, Katie Bedwell remarked. Thank you, Katie. I hope it'll be to everyone's liking, Barbara replied, casting an appreciative glance toward her stepmother-in-law, whose guidance had been invaluable on matters often left unspoken. As everyone settled around the table, with Mrs. Williams fussing over the placement of her sewing needles rather than the cooking utensils, Barbara served the dishes with a practiced hand. During the meal, talk turned to the everyday concerns of life on the prairie. "Harvey, I reckon we could spare a bit of hay this season," George Bedwell said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Might not be much, but every bit counts." "Much obliged, Pa. I was thinkin' the same with the Williamses here, and perhaps Mr. Jefferson might have some to spare as well," Harvey replied, his entrepreneurial mind already tallying the potential resources. "Yes, we can part with some," Mr. Williams nodded, his eyes flickering briefly towards his daughter. "The Applebys probably can as well. I know they had a good harvest this year." As the conversation flowed, Mr. Williams found a quiet moment to pull George aside, away from the chatter of the womenfolk and the clatter of dishes being cleared. "George," Mr. Williams began, I've been doing some thinking about the past, our disagreements." George's gaze remained steady, yet his expression betrayed no hint of the thoughts racing behind his brown eyes. "Times were hard on the trail, harder than any of us expected. Fear makes men say and do things they regret," Mr. Williams continued. "I spoke harshly of you and to you, and it's been sitting ill with me ever since." There was a pause as George regarded the man before him. "Your words mean something, coming from you," George finally said. "Let's look forward, for our children's sake," Mr. Williams added, extending a hand. The two men shook hands, the simple act bridging the chasm of years and misgivings. They turned back to the table where their families awaited. The laughter and light-hearted banter resumed. Barbara watched her father, noting the way the corners of his eyes softened ever so slightly. Her heart swelled with cautious optimism as she witnessed a subtle shift in George Bedwell's demeanor. It was as if the walls he had built around himself were being chipped away, stone by stone. In that moment, Barbara felt as though the very air in the room changed, growing lighter, warmer. She caught Harvey's eye across the table, and they shared a quiet smile. Their union had been a point of contention, yet now it seemed to be the catalyst for the healing of old wounds. An unspoken understanding passed between the two men, and Barbara dared to hope that the animosity that had shadowed their families might finally be laid to rest. As the night unfolded, Barbara's spirits soared. Her father's gesture, a mere bending of pride, had set them on a course toward reconciliation. Barbara caught her breath as she noticed her mother and Katie exchanging glances. It was a silent language spoken in the arch of an eyebrow, the curve of a smile, acknowledging that something momentous was unfolding before them. She felt Harvey squeeze her hand, a gesture invisible to the others but as loud as a shout in the quiet understanding between them. "Harvey tells me you've been discussing crop rotations, George," Mr. Williams ventured, his tone cautious yet curious. "I reckon there's merit in letting the land rest." "Yes," George replied. "The earth can only give so much before it needs to take a little back. Like people, I suppose." "Definitely like us." Mr. Williams nodded. "We push too hard, and we break. We let ourselves heal, and we grow stronger." "My patient used to tell me that," George said softly. "She'd say, 'George, you're no good to anyone worn down to a nub.' And by thunder, she was right." "Women often are," Mr. Williams admitted. "My Eliza, I don't know if she has a name, has more sense in her little finger than I've got in my whole body." As everyone laughed, Barbara exchanged a look with her mother. "Speaking of our better halves," Mr. Williams continued, "it seems they've done a fine job raising our children. Barbara here, teaching all those children at the schoolhouse, I never would have imagined." "Harvey's was a godsend to the farm before he started his own," George added. "He's got a knack for animals, and a head for figures. Not sure where he got that from, certainly wasn't me." Barbara felt a swell of affection for these two rugged men. She glanced again at her mother and Katie, their faces alight with a soft glow of triumph. It was a victory, not just for their families, but for the community they were all part of. In this untamed world, survival meant banding together, and tonight, they were forging bonds that would help them all endure. As the men's voices hummed a low baritone of shared experiences, Mrs. Williams cleared her throat gently and all eyes turned to her. She had been silent for most of the meal, her fingers fussing with the hem of her napkin, but now there was a determination in her gaze that commanded attention. "Times have been hard," she started. "When we were crossing the plains, I feared for our children, for the life we were heading towards. But one thing I learned is that love and forgiveness are like the waters of a river, they can carve through the hardest stone." Mrs. Williams continued, sharing a tale of a time when illness struck their caravan, how neighbors who had been at odds came together to nurse each other's kin. Bygones became just that, bygones. We learned that holding on to anger was a luxury we couldn't afford. As the dusk settled outside, the room seemed to grow warmer, the air lighter. Laughter began to punctuate the conversation, first tentative, like the uncertain steps of a fawn, then rolling free and easy as Mr. Bedwell recounted a humorous misadventure involving a stubborn ox and a muddy river crossing. Their laughter melded, bridging the gap between past grievances and present camaraderie. It was the sound of barriers crumbling, of understanding taking root. They laughed about the quirks of frontier life, Harvey's inventive attempts at cooking that ended up more suitable for livestock than people, and the way Barbara could turn any wild berry or root into a palatable jam or pie. "Seems we've been judging the book by a tattered cover," George Bedwell said. "And missing out on the story within." "Yes," Mr. Williams agreed, his weathered face creased in a smile. "We've all fought tooth and nail to get here, to build something. It's high time we did it together." "Pa, Mr. Williams," Harvey finally spoke, his voice steady with conviction. "You have our word, we'll honor what you've started here tonight. We'll build a life that respects both your legacies." When the door finally creaked shut behind the last of their kin, Barbara wanted to squeal with joy. Finally, their parents had seen eye to eye, and there would be no more complaints about their marriage. Barbara watched as her husband sat down on the foot of the bed, pulling off one boot, and then the other. She moved closer, sitting beside him. "I cannot express how thankful I am that our fathers are finally not filled with hate." He nodded. "I agree. It's time." "Harvey," she said, hesitating for a moment. "I was afraid, once, that maybe we'd rushed into this life together. That maybe I hadn't listened enough to reason, just let my heart lead me headlong into a marriage I had no right to be part of." He turned toward her, his brown eyes searching hers with an intensity that spoke more than words. "Barbara," he said softly, "we've weathered storms fiercer than most could dream. But here we are, a month into our marriage, stronger for it. Don't doubt the heart that's been braver than any I've known." "Your heart led you true," he continued, thumbs brushing away the moisture at the corners of her eyes, "just as mine did when I first laid eyes on you. We're meant to be together." A smile tugged at the corner of her lips, and she leaned into his touch, feeling the truth of his words meld with her own realizations. Her fears dissipated like mist before the morning sun, leaving only the certainty that they were meant to conquer this life together. "Show me again," she whispered, "how right our hearts were." In answer, Harvey lifted her effortlessly, his strength evident as he carried her to their modest bed, tucked in the corner of the single-room cabin. Their lips met in a kiss that held the fervor of new beginnings and the promise of countless sunrises shared. With deft fingers, Barbara undid the buttons of his shirt, revealing skin bronzed by the relentless pioneer sun. His hands, equally skilled, traced the outline of her waist before slipping under the fabric of her dress, pulling it over her head with a careful urgency. Bare to each other, Harvey's kisses trailed from the valley between her collarbones to the peaks and plains of her body, each caress stoking the fire that blazed within her. Barbara responded with equal fervor. They moved together, a dance as old as time, paced by the rhythm of whispered endearments and the creak of the wooden bed. As love crested between them like the rolling waves of the prairie grasses in the wind, Barbara clung to Harvey, her anchor in the tempest of sensation. Together, they soared to the heights of passion. When at last they lay entwined, spent and sated, the quiet of the cabin enveloped them like a cocoon. They knew their love would last. Epilogue. September 1860. Barbara lay on the bed, sweat-dampened strands of hair clinging to her forehead. The air was thick with tension and anticipation, pierced intermittently by cries that had gone on for hours. But now, as dusk settled over the prairie, a new sound, a baby's wail, filled the space with life. "Mrs. Bedwell, you have a son," Mrs. Mitchell announced, her voice both tired and triumphant as she worked with practiced hands to clean the newborn. The midwife's presence was a comfort. Barbara accepted the tiny bundle into her arms, her exhaustion replaced by a surge of wonder. His cries softened, as if he recognized the heartbeat that had lulled him for 9 months. William George Bedwell, named for his grandfathers. As soon as Mrs. Mitchell was finished, she invited Harvey into the house. He'd been pacing in the barn for hours. Harvey sat beside her, his dark hair falling into his brown eyes, which were fixed on the infant's face. His hands hesitated at his sides, as if uncertain how to handle such delicate newness. But there was no uncertainty in his gaze, only awe. "Look at him," Harvey whispered, leaning closer. Barbara now held the most precious shield of their love. "William," she breathed out. Everything they had been through had disappeared from her mind while she held their perfect child. Harvey reached out, his fingertip gently brushing the baby's cheek. "Welcome to the world, William George Bedwell," she said, her heart swelling. In her arms, she held not just her son, but the future of their family. Harvey's hand found its way to Barbara's own as they sat side by side. The baby in her arms cooed, a fragile sound that echoed through their small cabin, filling it with life. "Look at him," Harvey said, his voice thick with wonder. "He's got your eyes, Barbara." Barbara turned to meet his gaze. "And he has your strength," she replied. "Even now, I can feel it in his grip." They both chuckled softly as their son's tiny hand closed around Barbara's finger, holding on with a surprising firmness. "Out here, everything is so uncertain," Harvey murmured, his brown eyes scanning the shadows that danced across the walls from the flickering candlelight. "But one thing I'm sure of is that we'll love him with all we have. And he will always know it," Barbara added quietly. "And he'll always know of our love for each other." Harvey brushed his lips against hers. "I'm sorry I couldn't build a real house this summer, but next year, you'll have your house." "No reason to worry about that," she said softly. "Anywhere I am with you is home. And William will always know that his home is filled with love."